Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Today, my name is Kim Ricketts, and I manage the Visiting Speaker Series for Microsoft Research. Today, I'm happy to introduce to you David Weinberger. Maybe, for many of you, it'll be reintroducing you to David Weinberger because you're probably familiar with his earlier books, The Clue Train Manifesto and Small Pieces Loosely Joined. Both of them international bestsellers. There they are. Today, he's here to discuss his latest work, a book titled, rather alarmingly, Everything is Miscellaneous. Why is this alarming? Because as human beings, we seem driven to sort, count, label, and order information, for we need to organize it to understand it. But now we're swimming in more information coming at us in more ways from more sources and continuously. So how do we master and understand it all if our previous systems of organization cannot hold or grow to include it? After a whirlwind history, I've already read the book, after a whirlwind history through some of the most well-known and accepted orders, things like the alphabetical order, the Dewey Decimal System, periodic table, etc., after looking at those and how those evolved, which is really kind of a bizarre story how they evolved, and we expect them to be actually mean something, but they're quite random. And after a whirlwind history through all of those, Davis takes us deeper into our understanding of the miscellaneous world that we all now live in, a world of YouTube and Flickr and Wikipedia and open source, and it's a place where we can call knowledge unchained or information without borders. The question before us today is, how are we going to thrive and prosper in this new miscellaneous world? So please welcome David Weinberger.
Thank you. Thank you, Kim. That was a very good summary. We're pretty much done now. So thanks very much. Thank you for arranging this, and thank you for having me. So, this presentation I keep trying to shorten it, and then I think of something else to put in, so it never actually gets short. However, I can talk fast, which is like shortening it. So that's what I'm going to do, and there should be plenty of time to talk. This is in fact our miscellaneous drawer in our kitchen, only slightly spiced up because it wasn't enough color, so I grabbed some colored objects and put them in. But otherwise, and we all have it. And one of the ways of taking the overall theme of the book is to say, we've gotten very good at making complex organizations like this or whatever sort of diagram you might draw. And whether it's something on paper or you're organizing your kitchen, you almost always end up with some box for the miscellaneous into which you shove things, because your org scheme doesn't work perfectly. And in fact, if that box gets too big, then your organization scheme has failed and you have to redo it. So the argument of the book is essentially that as we move online, this is what you want to have happen. You want the miscellaneous category to eat the rest of your org chart in most cases, because it's good for business. It's also actually good for science. It's good for government. It's good for education. Or another way of putting this is to say in the West we've had a culture that for a long time, and we've only started climbing out of this relatively recently, for a long time we've assumed in the West that there is a right order, that the universe is ordered in some way, and it's up to us to try to figure it out. Well, in fact, what the digitizing of everything is telling us is that there is no one order. And that limitation has been a limitation both on efficiency and in business, but also a limitation that we don't need of thought. So we're all really used to playlists, take them for granted. But they're actually pretty extraordinary objects. Before this, if you wanted to organize your physical CDs, you'd have to fight with your roommate or your spouse or whoever about should you do it by genre, by chronology. You have to pick one way because that's how atoms work. But with playlists, you don't. If it's digital music, obviously you make as many different ways of organizing it as you want. When you go into the physical world, somebody has to make that decision. And it doesn't matter, the person may be great at it, and this is obviously a science, how you do this. It's merchandising in the retail world, it's library science elsewhere. This is genuine science. Nevertheless, it means that one person or committee has to figure out the single way of organizing it, and it simply cannot be right for everyone. But you got to do that because it's physical stuff, and that's how it works. In fact, in the real world, it seems like reality's secret purpose is in fact just to keep things apart. That's what reality does really, really well. So when we've organized physical things, we've just, without thinking about it, we've had to obey two basic principles, the reality principles of organization. And the first is that two things can't occupy the same space at the same time. No matter how much you try, you can't do it. It's just atoms work that way. And the second constraint is we need to have, everything has to have a place. Everything has to go somewhere in the world. And so we have different ways of sorting and organizing in different domains. We get very good at it, whether it's retail or education or science, museums for that matter, even religion. When it comes to the physical, everything has to go in one place because that's just the way it is. Well, immediately, a power regime grows out of this, especially once you add paper, which is expensive and difficult, and so only a handful of people get to publish and decide what gets published. And because of that, people then have to be put in a position where they decide what makes it into the 32 volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica and what the order of that will be. It's 32 volumes and 65,000 topics in the Britannica, not because that's exactly how many topics there are that are interesting and important to humans. Rather, it's an economic decision. It's based upon the cost of atoms. They don't want to do 34 volumes. It gets too big and expensive. So 32 volumes, 65,000 topics. In fact, if you wanted to know what humans are interested in, you could, because you're from Mars, you could go to the Britannica and look through it and you'd see Peloponnesian War. We're apparently very interested in the Peloponnesian War. Or you could go to Wikipedia with 1.7 million topics in English so far, and you would see this incredible range of stuff that we're interested in. And some of it is trivial and slightly embarrassing, the deep-fried Mars bar entry, the heavy metal umlaut, history of the heavy metal umlaut, which is just actually a really good article about the history of the use of umlauts in heavy metal bands. That would give you, in fact, a better sense of what it is that human beings care about, for better or for worse. Because it's no longer limited by, and furthermore, you don't have to have editors who decide, who are put in this position of power. Because everything has to go somewhere, you need editors who figure out what's important enough to make it into the newspaper. That is what we should be interested in. And second of all, because paper has a hierarchy, has a priority, which things make it on the front page. And generally, we're good at making these decisions. Generally. Nevertheless, it's somebody else's decision about what's interesting to me. And that can't ever be right for all of us because we're actually quite different. We do this sort of categorization, organizing all the time. A lot of it's trivial. It doesn't really matter how you organize your CDs, but sometimes it really, really does matter. So during the bad times of apartheid, there are 3,000 pages of race laws figuring out what the categories are and how the races should behave. If you were not white, you carried around, and by the way, the category of white, they totally had a fudge. They had to come up with a category called honorary white, because even with 3,000 pages, they couldn't figure out a way to give privilege to everybody they wanted to give privilege to. So there was a category of honorary white. This is a really bizarre. This shows you how broken and evil this racial system was. There's one guy who, by the time he was 50, he had had 5 different races. He had been reclassified 5 times. He wakes up one day and he reads he's a different race. In one case, the classification required him to leave his wife and family because he was no longer allowed to live with a person of that race. Just another quick example in case, the seriousness of this. This is 1972 at the American Psychiatric Association, where for the first time a gay psychiatrist acknowledged that he was gay and spoke to the group. It was John Fryer, except nobody knew that at the time, because in order to acknowledge this, he had to put on a mask, a wig, 2 layers of clothing, and a voice disguiser. Because homosexuality was a disease, and you could not have that disease and be a psychiatrist. You just weren't allowed. A couple of years later, there was a panel where another gay psychiatrist came out of the closet bravely and gave a paper called "Stop It, You're Making Me Sick," which was literally the case. And the moment that the APA book of what is a disease, what is a disorder, reclassified homosexuality so it was no longer a disorder, this guy was cured. It was just that simple. It was just that simple. So classification permeates our lives in every direction. We can do it because, the idea that we followed for why we can do it is expressed really beautifully by Plato, who says that the master dialectician, the person who's able to think clearly and correctly, carves nature at its joints, which is just a poetic phrase that's stuck to our detriment, in fact, but it has an incredible power. And the idea is just so clear and compelling, because we know what it's like to hack away, because he is thinking about carving up an animal. Right? I just like this traitor to its species here, smilingly pointing it. So we know exactly what Plato's talking about. You can carve at the joints, or you can hack at the bone, and hacking at the bone is inefficient. It's not the way the animal is sort of meant to be chopped up. And so we've thought that this is the case also for nature, that nature just has these joints, and ways you can cut it that make sense, and ways that you're sort of just hacking at it. And the power of that metaphor has haunted us ever since. For example, now I know that we're modern, so we don't fully believe what Plato said, but I think we actually do sort of believe what Plato said. This past summer, the International Astronomical Union had a rare chance to really set us straight on this, and they failed, and I think basically out of cowardice. So the question is, what is a planet? Which became an urgent question because we're discovering more things that are like planets, and it turns out we have never had a definition of planet. We've been able to point at some of the, that's how, the wanderers in Greek. There were these lights that are wandering against the firmaments. I think that's singular. It's like the internets. But we haven't had a definition that allows us to say when we discover a new large ice ball, that is or is not a planet. So the IAU set up committees for years that met, and twice actually, 2 committees. They threw out the first one, then they threw out the second one, and they instead put it to majority vote in Prague at a scientific meeting this past summer. And so they tried to come up with a definition, and they came up with a 2-part definition, 2 criteria. The first is, because the planet has to be big, we know that. It's got to be big, but big is not science. What constitutes big? So if they thought maybe, well, we'll do it as a percentage of mercury, but that's way too arbitrary. That's not science. So they said, science. We'll get all scientifical here, and we'll say that something is big enough to be a planet if it has enough mass that the gravity rounds the object. Because now we have a physical principle. It's not just, it's yay big. It's gravity does something. So it's got to be big enough to round itself, and second of all, it has to clear the space around it, which is there simply in those 2 together. You put them together, you get 8 out of the 9 planets back. Can't quite get the 9th, but we at least got 8 of them. So why those 2 criteria, which are bizarre criteria? They're not only bizarre, nothing follows from them. A criterion like it has an atmosphere. That's an interesting criterion, because there's other stuff you can look at. Or there's water. Neil deGrasse Tyson, the astrophysicist at the Museum of Natural History, has a book called Death by Black Hole, collection of essays, very good. And he says, there are 4 at the museum, they no longer care about the 9 planets. Those are they're nice traditional objects, but that's not an interesting cluster of objects in our solar system. Objects that have water, that's interesting, because maybe there's life there. And there are 4 objects that we know that have water. One of them is a moon. It's Titan. It's a moon of Saturn. That's an interesting way of classifying. So why pick those criteria? Because we wanted to save the planets. Why? Because we wanted to add the planets. But it's not interesting science at all. It's not a scientific discussion. What would be an interesting scientific discussion is, and the IAU had a chance to make this clear to people, look, there are lots of ways of slicing up the solar system. And some are really interesting, depending upon what you're interested in. If you're trying to think about mining on other planets, then objects that have lots of copper, that's interesting. If you're thinking about objects hurtling towards the Earth, that's an interesting category. Big objects big enough to round themselves? Not interesting. It'd be far better to think about the solar system as being a set of objects that have a set of attributes. And those attributes allow us to cluster them depending upon what our interests are. That is, in my terminology, it's a big miscellaneous bunch of stuff that we get to decide based upon our interests how to cluster. But they decided, for the sake of the children, not to take that path. So from Plato's point of view, the universe looks like this. There are places to cut and places you don't cut. But it seems that it's actually way more like this, that the universe is just full of attributes, of places to cut. Every attribute or property, you can join up with other things that have that attribute. And that's to say you can cut the universe that way. Things with water, things with atmosphere, things with copper, things hurtling towards us. There is an indefinite number of attributes, ways of cutting up the pig. Which is not to say you can cut it up any way you want arbitrarily. Umberto Eco, the novelist and academic philosopher, surprisingly, says, look, there's lots of ways of cutting up the cow. Sorry, he's using a cow example, but there's none that connects the snout and the tail. So not every way of cutting works, but there are so many ways of cutting that it's really up to us to decide which ones work given our interest in our project. We're able to categorize because there are likenesses, and every time that's what categorization does. It brings together two things that are alike, but we get to say what the likeness is, depending upon what we're trying to do. There are lots and lots of ways of doing this. Some of them are wrong, because that's not an orange thing. It can be right, too, but that's fundamentally not right. You can make mistakes. Right? I just want to make that clear. It's not that everything works, but there are so many ways that do. In fact, you can almost always bring together two things and find some way that they should be lumped together. Fortunately, it seems that the universe does cluster attributes. It's not just this random array of swirling attributes. They come in lumps, which means that something that looks like this and smells like this and feels like this, predictably, probably going to taste like it. Although occasionally we pull the wax fruit out from between our teeth, generally this clustering stuff works, and that's just, that seems to be how we were made, how the universe was made, which is a good thing because it adds a level of predictability. So we cluster stuff based upon some attributes that we think are important, and then we cluster the clusters, and then we cluster the clusters, and we end up with one of our favorite ways of organizing, which is a taxonomic tree, a hierarchical tree, which is an incredible way, amazingly powerful way of organizing complex systems, because it was Aristotle who first sort of figured this out, that this is what we do. And clearly language was already doing this sort of clustering, but Aristotle looked at it and said, no, this is a principle of knowledge. This is how the world is laid out. Although he didn't get it, he never drew it as a tree. It took like another 500 years of Syrian philosopher named Porphyry who first took Aristotle and said, oh, tree-like, and actually drew a tree. So for Aristotle, to say what something is to say, well, what category does it belong to? It belongs to fruit, so that's what it's like. But also, how is it different from the other things in that category? Oh, it's the red round fruit, or the rational animal. This system of likeness and difference allows you to know what this is and to see where it is in this entire universe of organization without ever having to think the whole thing through. So if you know that apple is a fruit, you already know, because of the hierarchy here, that it's a plant. It has something to do with a plant. Well, you don't have to think that every time you see an apple, but it's there, hidden, implicit, ready for you to use if you need to. So this is a really powerful way of showing and hiding information to a great degree of complexity. But it also, in this particular type of organization, which we take as a pinnacle, really clear, powerful, Aristotle thought that this was the way the world was organized. We still like these ways of doing it. Everything has a single place. Every leaf goes on a single branch, and there's nothing left over. We love these types of trees. All right, in some environments where you're organizing along a sort of a single set of criteria, and where you need absolute clarity and no ambiguity, possibly because of power relationships and legal requirements, these things work great. So they, in an odd way, result from how we organize physical objects. So this is laundry. This is clean laundry. And what you do when you get clean laundry is you divide it up. The indexers call this lumping and splitting. It's technical terms. Genuinely, I mean, it's genuinely technical terms. So what you do is you get a lump, and then you split it. And then you split that lump, and you split that lump, and you split that lump. So generally, we split laundry first by person, and we get a couple of new lumps. And then we do it by body part, and then we may go down some more levels until we are at, sort of the nodes of the tree. And you get to pick what the lumps are going to be. So maybe you divide by sports clothes versus business clothes, or by winter or summer, whatever it is. But you have whatever way you have. When you are sorting, everything has to go into one pile. That is, you can't put it into two piles. You have to choose which lump you're going to put it in. And you go back and forth, but ultimately, because they're atoms, you have to put it in one pile. It's a binary decision. It's just the way it is. Well, if you were then to go back through the history of the lumping and splitting that you did to put away your laundry, you would get a tree. These trees are representations of the limitation of the physical, that it has to go somewhere. One branch, one leaf goes on A leaf can only go on one branch, and it has to go somewhere. And that's fine for when we're organizing physical objects, when we're trying to figure out where do we put our CD or the new book that came in, or we're in a store, we own a store, where does the camera go? Of course, that's fine. We've got to do that. But it's a terrible limitation on thought and ideas. Why would we organize our ideas in the same way that we sort our laundry? It's a terrible limitation. It's there because we have communicated and preserved ideas, information, and knowledge in physical objects and books. And books are wonderful. I'm writing them and selling them, so I won't bother. Books are great, but books are a terrible pain in the ass. If you find something here in this book over here, and it's got a footnote because it's a link, and you want to follow it, you want to put together ideas. This is not the Harvard Library. The Harvard Library is actually the Widener, which is one of the world's great libraries, is far, far harder to navigate than this. So, if you're at the Widener, you find a book here, you literally are going to have to go to an elevator to get to the bridge, to go down to the floor where the tunnel is, to get to the other side of the building, to get to the shelf where the book is probably checked out. It's as if libraries were designed to keep ideas apart, because they're in physical objects. It's the best we can do, but it's not nearly good enough now that we can do something else. So, if you want to see this really clearly, I feel bad picking on Melville Dewey. It's just way too easy, but I'm going to anyway. So the Dewey Decimal System, which is used to organize 90% of the U.S. public libraries and public schools, he was 21 in 1876 when he decided he would organize all knowledge. Why not? He hadn't quite finished college. He was at a tiny Orthodox Christian school. He grew up in a tiny town. He was at this point, a very provincial person, but he's 21. He's going to organize all knowledge. What's the big deal? He was an extreme rationalist. In addition to the Dewey Decimal System, he founded organizations for spelling simplification. He changed his name to Dewey for a while, then changed it back. The Melville was always, he'd shortened the Melville, made it more rational from the beginning. He also believed in shorthand and in the metric system. And these are all highly rational activities. In fact, he was so rational, he loved decimals. And he recognized that this was, he loved decimals. How do you explain this? But he loved decimals. So he would try to arrange his travel so that he would arrive on a day that ended with a 0. This is where rationality fades into peculiarity, into crazy. So he came up with a system. And he said, decimals, oh, Lord loves decimals, so I'm going to divide up all knowledge into 10 topics. And each of those, I'll divide into 10. And then each of those, I'll divide into 10. And I will have 1,000 integers. There is a priority both up and across. So more abstract and more important is up, and also to the left is more important. The hundreds are more important than the 900s. So this is crazy. Of course, you can get as many decimal numbers as you want. So it has infinite expandability once you get past the honor and dignity of the decimal of an integer. This is as if you said, I'm building a new kitchen. I like decimals, so I'm going to have 10 cabinets. And each cabinet shall have 10 shelves. And each shelf shall have 10 slots. And I will organize in units of 10. So I come to my spice shelf. I have 10 spots. And I must fill it with 10 spices because I'm crazy. And so that's what I'm going to do. I only have 8. So I look around and I say, you know what? Chocolate sprinkles? Chocolate shot? Well, that's a spice. Don't you think that's a spice? And so I put it on the spice shelf because I have to fill it up. It wouldn't be too hard to come up with the top. By the way, if you want to see doing this requires you to expose your biases, your way of thinking about the world, and which you can see if you compare how you might organize your kitchen to how your kids might do it. They just have different interests, so of course the world is going to look different. So Dewey had to make up his mind. What are the top 10? He's a 21-year-old kid, Orthodox Christian school. He learned some from Hegel and from before that from Bacon about how knowledge is divided up, but they didn't do 10s. They did 3s. And it's from there that he got the idea that philosophy is the queen of the sciences. That's the foundational thing. Philosophy and psychology at the time. So the hundreds, philosophy. So you look at the integer numbers here. paranormal, occult, parapsychology, divinatory graphology, that is predicting the future based upon your handwriting, and phrenology, predicting your personality based upon the bumps on your head. These are worthy of integers. These are still in the Dewey Decimal System. These are the top levels. So this is religion. I'll just do one more because this is just way too easy. Religion, you have 10 top-level categories to play with. 9 of them are Christianity. Right? Because that's obviously, that's what knowledge is about. But he does leave room. There are other religions that get integers. For example, the Jews, we get our own integer. Yeah! Islam sort of does. It has to share it. Now, this has been updated. 297 was updated a few years ago. So it's Islam, Babism, and Baha'i, which is, I guess, fine, except that there are a lot of Muslims. Babism and Baha'i are 19th century religions, so there are a lot of Muslims who think that this is mixing the venerable Islam with Johnny-come-latelys. But still, you got to make a decision, so that's what they've done. Zoroastrianism, 295, gets its own integer. Buddhism? To the right of the decimal point. Not quite. So let's fix it. Because the people who own the Dewey Decimal System are librarians. These are not small-minded provincial people. These are librarians who are fully aware of what the world is like. Nevertheless, and they do tinker with it all the time, nevertheless, it remains fundamentally broken because it has to be broken. So let's say we fix it up. We got everything, just got rid of the obvious things that no longer make sense. You send the librarians out with their razor blades to scrape the white ink off of the backs of these millions and millions of books, and as soon as you publish the new system, people will be arguing about it. Shiites and the Sunnis, do they go on the same level? Depends who you ask. The Jews for Jesus, where do you put them? The Jews don't want them in their category. Christians not too happy about them either. Scientology at the same level of... who's going to decide? No, the problem is not that the Dewey Decimal System gets things wrong. It's that there isn't a right way, because we don't agree. And we have a lot of experience at this point. It's called history that tells us we're not going to agree, especially about the deep questions of how we categorize ourselves and others, how we look at our world. It's not going to happen. So it can't happen simply because there is a Dewey Decimal System, because it's dealing with shelving physical objects, has to make decisions about which shelf things are going to go on. Got to do that in the world of atoms. It will never be a satisfactory system simply because of that fact. But now we're digitizing everything, so at long last we can get away from this. So there are 4... I should tell you I'm going to come to what sounds like the ending, but it's not. I say, and then I go on from there. I just want to warn you, it's coming in a few minutes. It seems useful to me to think about there being 3 orders of order. In the first order, this is the Bettman Archive, which was bought by Bill Gates about 6 years ago because it was melting in Manhattan. It's the country's most important archive of historical photos, and it's now buried safely 220 feet below ground. So in the first order, you organize the physical objects themselves. You put the images, you put the photographs in folders, you put the books on the shelves, you put the merchandise on the shelves. You organize the stuff itself. And you get to do only one order, of course, only one way of organizing it. In the second order, you separate the metadata, the information about the stuff, of metadata. I guess you know what metadata is. Sorry. Perhaps you've heard of this thing called metadata. So you separate the metadata. You almost always have to reduce the amount of information. In the case of a card, library, catalog, you reduce it to what fits on a 3x5 card, which is a terrible reduction of a book. But there's a genuine science to it, so we do the best we possibly can to figure out what do you need on that card. You reduce the information, you separate it, and now you can organize it maybe 3 different ways, maybe 4. The subject, author, title. You can't do a lot more than that, though, because then the catalog gets too big to be useful. So that's the second order. It's obviously a big step forward. Third order, everything is digital. The data and the metadata, the content and the metadata, all digital. And that changes the basic principles. So I'm going to point quickly to 4 principles that change. The first is that in the physical world, if you get a physical camera into your store, you're going to have to put it on a single shelf. Digitally, if it's a new camera you want to tell people about, you will put it onto as many shelves as you possibly can. It's good for everybody to do that. Customers find it. You sell more. Why not? So a leaf now can go on many branches. And sort of the hidden importance of this, which I won't dwell upon unless you really want me to, and believe me, you don't, is that for Aristotle and for our tradition, remember Aristotle was the philosopher up until the Enlightenment. I mean, he got it right. He got it so right that the best minds in Western culture couldn't figure out a way even to tweak him. He got it so right. So for Aristotle, where you are in this tree is the same thing as what you are. It's your being. It's not just, a definition. It's what you are. And so if you now can be in multiple places in a tree, you can now be simultaneously different things. And that is ontologically not possible. That violates the most basic rule. Say what?
No, card catalogs let you do that?
They're not putting, but you have, because it's a physical object, you have to have a primary sort. And then you are allowed other accidental properties.
So card catalogs don't sort by author and by subject and by
Yes, they
title.
do. They allow you to sort in multiple ways, but they're sorting physical objects that are arranged in one way. And so there's a primary sort. Library of Congress as well. I mean, there's a primary sort, and then you have in Library of Congress up to 10 see alsos or references. So yeah, the system, both for navigation and organization, but also in terms of philosophy, has to accommodate the fact that Socrates is a man, is a human, but is also short and snub-nosed. And so Aristotle figured all this out. I mean, there's accidental and essential properties. And the essential one is that he's human, and it's just an accident that he's snub-nosed. So, but yes. And, yeah. Okay. So, the second is that in the real world, mess is almost always terrible because you can't find stuff, but online it's actually really, really useful. And that's because we can sort the mess with metadata and leave the original stuff untouched. So we can make multiple sense of it. In fact, at some levels, if you put up a blog post and there's so many links to it, you can't even follow them. You can't, they're just sprawling all over the place. That's a sign of a really successful blog post. There's each of those links add meaning and context. It enriches the pile. Third is, we've gotten used to the world, in the world of computing, we've gotten used to the idea that there's a difference between data and metadata, and we know what that difference is. But that's being erased now. So that if, for example, you know the author of the book, but you want to find out the title of the book and maybe more, you say, okay, I'll go to a search engine and I will type in Herman Melville. That's the metadata, and it will come back with the data I'm looking for, which is the name of the book. In fact, it may well these days come back with the actual content of the book, which means you can also now say, I remember some of the content of that book. I think it was the first line. It was Call Me Ishmael. What book and who wrote it? So you go to the search engine, you type in the content, and now you will get back the author, which means everything is metadata. Which is important because we use metadata to pry up knowledge. Metadata is a thing that you know. This is, in fact, now the only difference between data and metadata is metadata is a thing that you know, and data is a thing you don't know but you're looking for. And if metadata is a lever we use to pry things up, then if everything is metadata, if the contents now are metadata, then we've gotten much, much smarter. We have many more ways of prying things up, and the connections are way richer. The fourth principle that changes, I think, is that if you go into a real store, physical clothing store, and you do the rational thing, which is to take your shopping cart and to pull off all the clothing that fits you and to ignore everything else. So you just make this big pile, because everything else is just noise. You make this big pile in your shopping cart so you can go through it. You'll be thrown out in 90 seconds. They will not let you do that, because the people who own the stuff have also owned the organization of it. But if you go online to a store, a virtual store, and that store insists on showing you everything in sizes you don't care about, wrong gender, wrong season, you'll leave in 30 seconds. You want to be able to organize it exactly the way you want. And you're right to demand that. So the owners of the stuff, of the information, no longer own the organization of it. So just briefly, two ways in which we're doing this to try to, and if you're familiar with these, just look incredibly bored, or even moderately, and I'll move on. This is faceted classification. Okay, so faceted classification is, this is the North Carolina State University Library. It's a way of providing tree-like hierarchical taxonomic browsing. Just browse down the branches of the tree, because there are tremendous advantages to doing that, but without specifying ahead of time exactly what the tree looks like. Because you don't know, as the organizer of this, how people are going to want to browse. So at NCSU, you can go to the you can go to the system and say, you know what, I'm interested in 19th century authors. Okay, good. Here are the 19th century authors. Now, underneath that, I'm interested in only in female authors. Okay, and German. Okay, and fiction. And so you've just walked the tree. And the next instant, you or somebody else says, you know what, I'm trying to find a book. I'm most interested in the topic. The topic is steam engines. Topic now becomes the root of the tree. And I want to see what women were writing about steam engines. Okay, women is next level. And I only care about German women for my research. And now you're walking down a different tree. The tree recomposes. It's a big computing problem, but we have now solved it. It allows you to walk down the tree that reflects your own interests and way of thinking about things. Lots of sites are using this now. This is Newegg, which has lots of electronic equipment, very handy. IBM uses it. They have a consultants database, 35,000 consultants worldwide. They used to spend weeks trying to pull together teams. Now they can say, you know what, what matters most is that we need French speakers, and then we need people who are absolutely top in their field, etc. And next time, but we don't care where they live because the client has lots of money and we'll fly them around. And next team, it's, no, very price sensitive. They all have to be on the East Coast. So you walk down the tree that way. So they're putting together teams in a day instead of in the weeks that it used to take them. So that's the first technique for how we, the users, are getting to organize other people's information. This is tagging, which I assume you're familiar with. This is delicious. I'll go ahead just in case somebody's too embarrassed to say, tagging? What's that? So this is delicious. This is somebody named Katrina. It's a bookmarking site where you can keep track of pages you want to remember. And when you do, it asks you for some meaning, for a tag, for some text. And so this is Katrina's tag cloud. You can tell a lot about her by looking at it. You know, the size of the font reflects the number of tags. In this case, just as an example, among the tags she's using is design. So we can click on that and see all of the pages that Katrina has tagged design, which is useful but gets really exciting when because of the fact that these are public tags. So at Delicious I can see all of the pages that anybody has tagged with design, which is like having the world do research for me. Because we're an insanely social species, we'll notice that over time that some people are really good taggers. They're tagging stuff that we find really interesting. Well, that's a pretty good basis for establishing a friendship. So we will get in touch with them, we'll get married, and have babies. So, super babies, super intelligent organizational babies. So, false ending. So, it seems to me that what we're doing is moving from assuming that the right way to organize is to get experts, genuine experts, together who decide, first of all, what it is that we should see, because to get rid of all the noise, because that's just waste of our time, and then figure out the categories into which to put things. Rather than doing that, I believe what we're doing is just ripping the leaves off the trees and making this gigantic miscellaneous pile of stuff, of web resources of every sort, at every level of granularity, which would be of absolutely no use to us except that we are constantly enriching it with metadata. We're connecting the pieces, which enable us to pull this stuff together, reflecting our interests and needs. So rather than saying, oh, rather than saying the pile has value if it's exclusive, if it only has good stuff in it, no, include everything. It's cheaper to include now than it is to delete, which is why your hard drives are filling up with DSC 00123.jpg files. It's too hard to go through them. So include everything. Include the Paris Hilton boob job article, which is clearly trivial trash. Nevertheless, it's guaranteed that within a year, 2 years, 5 years, 50 years, there's going to be somebody doing a research dissertation on early 21st century media attitudes towards women and their bodies, or treatment of the trivial. Somebody's going to be doing research on that, and it's not going to be trivial to them. Just as the 1961 Sears catalog is not trivial to us because there is an ad in it, an item in it, that was not tagged JFK at the time. The word JFK just isn't in there, but is the rifle that was used to kill him. We didn't know that was going to be interesting. Who could know? So include everything. It's not up to you to decide what's going to be interesting to other people. And second of all, postpone the moment when you classify it and categorize it. Postpone it until the moment the user says, this is what I'm interested in. This is how I view the world. And so we are getting these mashups, and this will just continue and continue because we're able to pull together information across multiple domains in ways that are interesting, even if we're not sure they're interesting. So in real estate, obviously you want to see all of the houses and where the good schools are and the crime reports. But maybe somebody it really matters to them where the political landscape is. This is Massachusetts, so the Republicans and Democrats. Maybe, somebody wants to buy a house based on the concentration of Starbucks really matters to this person. Or maybe more likely they want to be in a Starbucks-free zone, even if it means moving slightly offshore. Somebody's going to want to know where are the graveyards, and we hope it's because they like to do the rubbings, but who knows? Somebody wants to know that, and they want to know where the dog owners are, and there's one person who wants to know about the intersection of those two. So fine, go ahead, include everything. Flight path information is obviously of interest to people buying houses, except you don't know why it's going to be. My dissertation advisor, who's a fairly obnoxious man, you'd be sitting with a rare time in the backyard with him, and he would be sitting there in his shorts with his binoculars, which he conspicuously would not use, and he would say, he'd interrupt you, say, that's flight 2375, it's Air France going to Paris, it's a little late, and they seem to have swapped out the 727. Must be having engine trouble. He wanted to live under the flight paths. So you can't tell what people are going to be interested in, and we don't have to. We can leave it up to them now because you can include everything. So I want to, as quickly as I can, go through a couple of what I think this affects, and really 2 points, authority and understanding. So at Wikipedia, there's an article on tomatoes, of course, and there's a section on the pronunciation, tomato versus tomato. And of course, it's Wikipedia, so there's a discussion page for the tomato versus tomato. So I want to make up an example, just for simplicity. I'm going to say 3 people contributed to this section. The first person, by the way, it's Aristotle, but first person is genuinely, in my example, the world's greatest expert on the pronunciation. So he writes this perfect little piece. And along comes person number 2 who fixes it, improves it. First person looks at it and says, I'm sorry, greatest expert, I'm putting it back, and reverts it. Third person comes along, changes it. First person looks at it and says, okay, I figured Wikipedia out and I'm not going to participate. I am genuinely the world's greatest expert, so I'm just not going to participate. Well, amateurs are making my words worse. So he goes away, which obviously is his right. But as a result, over time, this person becomes irrelevant because we can't find him. He's not contributing to where we are getting our knowledge and information. And B, actually the social knowledge, the public negotiation of knowledge that occurs at Wikipedia actually generally makes the knowledge better. Now, you can find places where that's not the case. You can find experts who say that their words have been degraded. They may be right. But generally, we believe, and I think we're right, that opinion gets stronger when it's confronted in conversation. Bugs get driven out. Biases get driven out. It's not a perfect system, but it works pretty well. Knowledge here at Wikipedia is social. It does not belong inside the head of any one person. In fact, if these people actually worked together and compromised and went through the discussion pages and worked out words and negotiated, what they come up with was not in the head of any one of them. That's why they had to negotiate. The knowledge exists independently of them. It is not a mental product. By the way, it never was, but now it clearly isn't. It's a conversational product. Same thing happens on mailing lists. I've been on some mailing lists for a long time, for many years. One of them is FCC policy, which I know very little about. I lurk. I don't think I've ever contributed to it. I've been on the list at least 10 years. And there are people on it who know it's a way better source of information about FCC policy than any newspaper because it's too specialized. The New York Times doesn't cover that very much. Not nearly as well as this list does. And there are people on the list, I don't know who they are. I've gotten to know their names, but I know nothing about them, who are deep experts on this. And furthermore, it's not the expertise of any one individual because somebody will say something and somebody else will contradict or supplement. It's a conversation. And so the real knowledge that is in this mailing list is in the mailing list. It's not in any individual. The mailing list is a social object. It is also where social knowledge occurs. And that's increasingly the most valuable type of knowledge that we have. This occurs, the same sort of change is happening in the newspapers where editors, mainly middle-aged men in airless rooms, have decided what is worth covering, what's worth our knowing, and they're expert at it. They've devoted their lives to it. But they're just a bunch of people. and they can't represent all views. Dig and the myriad of other sites like it that have arisen do something different, so that people can nominate stories and the front page is constructed socially depending upon the thumbs up and the thumbs down for the particular articles. USA Today about a month ago redid its page, its site, and they took one of the Dig ideas, which is every article you can do a thumbs up. Okay, that's good, but where's the thumbs down? Because we see the front page article about Justin Timberlake getting slimed, and we want to be able to say, no, down, bad USA Today, no. But they won't give us that satisfaction, I assume because they're afraid. We want revenge, and we need the down button for that. So this idea is coming along, it is percolating. We'll see if this works. Maybe it's exactly what they need, I don't know. We also see this social basis of knowledge occurring in our children, so that if you have kids, if you're in an even relatively affluent community at this point, they are doing their homework on the computer, and the computer's on the internet, which means they are doing their homework socially. They have the IM sessions open, they've got their texting going on. Oh, the kids and their texting. And you know that they're talking about boys and girls and sports and movies or whatever, but they're also saying, what did you get for number 3? Or why is the teacher asking us about the economic causes of the Civil War? I thought economy meant money, and I don't understand that. And they're figuring it out. They're doing their homework socially, which is good, because we don't want them sitting. I don't want my kids sitting in a corner trying to figure the world out by themselves. That's what Descartes did, and it drove us down a very bad path for about 350 years. We don't want to do that anymore, and it's not realistic. That's not how they're going to be operating once they're out of school. They're going to be talking with others. And yet, even though our children have already figured it out, they're being tested, and increasingly, boy, are they being tested. They're being tested apart, as if the aim of knowledge was to fill up their heads and have them take a test. This is a real fracture point in our culture at this point. This is a really bad situation because it's souring a generation of children on education. When you do your report, do not use more than 2 internet references, because we know the internet has lots of bad information. And it does, of course it does. The internet has more of everything, more of terrible information and more of great information, and more of everything. The notion that we're going to protect our kids from the internet and teach them not to use it, oh my God, that's not how they're going to be working. They're going to go out, they're going to write a book. They're not going to do it in a library unless it's highly specialized, and that's the only, they're going to be doing it on the internet. That's how they're going to be learning stuff. And we really should be teaching them, insofar as we can, how to tell a good site, a trustworthy site, from one that isn't. Okay, so the last general point is, this is Martin Heidegger in 1927, a philosopher. We can talk about his politics later if you want. A miserable, rotten bastard, nevertheless, a really great philosopher. And one of the things that he said in his first book, I think is really true and important, which is, he asked, what does it mean to be something? Well, you can't do that generally. You have to take an example. So, a hammer. And not what would you think a hammer is if you came from Mars. As we understand hammers, what is it? And Heidegger says, well, okay, so to know what a hammer is, to understand what it is, you have to know about nails. You just do. If you don't, then you don't understand hammers. But to know what a nail is, you really have to understand how wood works, what wood is and how nails enter it, what sort of material it is. But to know what wood and boards are for hammering nails into, you really got to know about lumber. But lumber, you really have to know about trees. And trees, you better know they grow in a forest, and there's an economic system that connects the trees with the lumber yard. And the forest isn't just this thing. The forest grows on the earth under the sun. You have to know everything to know what a hammer is. And the hammer's meaning is not this simple thing exhausted by the definition, but is rather its place in this implicit context of reference, of significance. That's what a hammer is. We never get around to expressing the whole thing, but we don't need to, because it's all there implicit for us. It's this genuinely semantic web of meaning. So, one more step. As many have pointed out, including Andy Clark in a book called Being There, it's a really good book, our species seems to advance by externalizing functions of consciousness. So writing externalizes memory very, very usefully. Books externalize knowledge very usefully. Calculators externalize arithmetic. So what I want to suggest in a sketchy sort of way is that what we're now engaged in, maybe, in building this pile of leaves rich with metadata and connection, is that we're externalizing meaning, which we've never been able to do, at least not this way before. We do it every time we add tags. We're connecting ideas. So these things now cluster around the Ishmael tag or whatever. We do it every time we do a standard taxonomy, because these things are still valuable. We want these. We don't have to choose and say we will only allow this way of organizing ideas. We can have as many ways as we need. We do it every time we do an RDF triple in the semantic web. That's adding meaning to this pile, this miscellaneous pile. We do it every time we put up a page or a post where we have a link that's contextualized by language. And these are connections of meaning, of actual human intention and language and context. We do it through playlists for music, and at Harvard there's a playlist for syllabi, for course materials. That pulls things together. We do it through sites like Dig, where we're creating our own front pages. We do it every time we put in a hyperlink, the most fundamental activity of the web. No links, no web. Now, this is just the way it is. Every time we do one, we are drawing connections of human meaning. That is adding meaning and significance to this infrastructure of meaning that we're developing. And the most remarkable thing about this new infrastructure of meaning is not that it's so rich, although it's rich beyond anything we've ever had, or that it's so messy, but messy in ways that are productive and full of potential. I think the most important thing about it is that it's ours. It's fully ours. It's not something that was only created by experts who have credentials, who are important. We need them. But they're not the only ones. It's not created by a broadcast regime that we get to watch and not participate in. It's fully ours for the first time in our history. And this is a generational task, building this up and then using it to make sense of our world. Thanks. Okay then.
I'm sorry, I missed the first part, but I noticed that you used an interesting expression. You said on Wikipedia, opinions become stronger as more and more people contribute. So it's not facts, it's opinions.
If I used opinion, I shouldn't have. I should have said knowledge. But let's say I did say opinions. What do you make of that?
I agree with you about opinions. I'm not sure that it's, in some cases, you find the weirdest things are very good. So you go and find out, you go and look up an article on an EKGs or ECGs or something, and then you know a heck of a lot about it in, 20 minutes. But not always.
Yeah, it's not perfect.
And if I'm going to
Likewise, by the way, for Britannica, where you won't find what's 1.7 minus 65,000. You won't, most of the topics in Wikipedia you simply won't find in other encyclopedias. And when you do, sometimes they're fantastic, and sometimes Britannica articles are pretty biased and almost always unreadable, by the way. So yeah, absolutely, Wikipedia is stronger in some ways. It's notoriously stronger in technical and scientific, and acknowledges that it's way weaker in the humanities.
Yeah, the Britannica is uniformly dense. The Wikipedia is mixed quality.
Actually, I'm sorry, I guess I do mean to disagree. I think Britannica is actually wildly uneven in its readability, the density of the sort of information that's in there. I look through it, and there are articles, I don't know what the hell they're talking about. I can't make my way through it. And others are telling me stuff, it seems to me way too simple. But it doesn't matter. Absolutely, it is the case that Wikipedia is uneven, imperfect, generally getting better, which published encyclopedias that have generational lifetimes between printings, they get better too, but they also get better at the cost of, if you look at biographies in the Britannica from the 19th century of poets, of people that we still know of, they get shorter over time. We got to get more in. It's only got that much space. Wikipedia doesn't have that problem because it's not paper. So there are advantages to both. Wikipedia has strengths, particularly in some areas. It is certainly the case that Wikipedia has cultural bias. If you look at who invented the airplane in the French versus the English version of Wikipedia, they are not the same articles. They are not translations, that's for sure. Wikipedia famously was heavily influenced by geeks and techies, way more even than it is today when it started. And the preponderance of articles very clearly reflected that. I'm not sure. I'm sorry. It's really quick. I'm not sure this was ever actually true. I think it was, but in the early days, the line was that there were more articles about Middle Earth than about Africa, reflecting perhaps the interest of the contributors.
So as you talk about metadata and faceted browsing and that sort of things, anything can be a facet of a piece of information. And I was wondering, you kind of talk about using facets as a way of organizing our mess, but they're really just a mess also. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts.
Well, so facets are one technique that are well suited to pretty well-fielded metadata. For a faceted system to work, somebody has to declare what the facets are. There are people there are attempts to try to integrate a faceted system with a tagging system, or to use the folksonomy, the collection of tags, as a way of deriving what the facets should be. Siderian is a company that's been working on that. They went through Delicious and tried to facet the tags. In fact, they called it facetious, which is an intensely clever pun because it's got facet in it. And so there's progress, but if you do that, then the faceting system is somewhat looser. And so there's a company that has 25 million engineering parts. I mean, physical hardware, nuts and bolts. 25 million of these. It has, I think, 1,500 facets. Basically, that just comes from their database. It's the columns in the database become the facets. And so it's that's a stable, well-organized system that's been designed by data modelers, by experts. And typically that's what a faceted system does. It's not quite as everything is a facet as a
more broadly faceted browsing where you can use any type of metadata as a way.
Yeah, so a tagging system is a great example of
is a type of facet. So a tag is a facet. The words in a document may be a facet.
Yeah.
How many people have visited it? When the page was updated.
Amazon, significantly statistically important phrases. This weird thing they derive from. Yeah.
So you could just have you can have millions of facets about one piece of information. So as I try and understand or browse through the web, there may be more facets than there is even information. So it's just another. It's almost even messier to try to use the facets.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. No, that. It's likely actually that there's fewer facets than there is information, but that doesn't matter. There are still so many freaking facets, so many attributes, right?
Are information.
Properties. I was calling them attributes earlier. There are ways two things can be alike and thus can be joined. It's infinite is the wrong word, but it's indefinite, and it's way more than anybody could ever deal with. That's simply a reflection of the world, right? That's not something the web introduced.
People need to identify the facets that are important for organizing that information.
Yes.
And be it Dewey or an automatic system or something.
So, yes, in order to make sense of this, you need to have access to the metadata that is relevant to your... And we don't always. There's lots of times where we would search for stuff if only we don't even think about searching for it because we know that data isn't there. But over time, we're adding more and more and more. It's one of the things, tagging is a sudden shot in the arm in providing way more pieces of metadata that systems can grab onto. For all their messiness, we invent new ones all the time. We do some through algorithmically. We derive the metadata. Some we track implicitly what people are doing. Sometimes we ask people to do it. We are in the process now of solving a problem that seemed... So in the late 80s, who remembers SGML? SGML, anyone? Sorry, I was in the industry at the time. I was working in marketing at a company that was doing an SGML editor, among other things, a company called Interleaf. We were partners with Microsoft. Yeah. SGML failed in it did many good things. It failed to be what people wanted it to be because it required people to explicitly enter metadata, which people will not do unless they are disciplined to do so. Tagging has succeeded, where they explicitly enter metadata. Interesting. So we seem to have somehow gotten past this enormous limitation. The most valuable metadata usually is the stuff that people explicitly write down, but people don't like explicitly writing down. Is anybody here from the office group? Do you happen to know what percentage of people fill out the lovely metadata form on a Word document? last time I checked, which was in the like 1994, so it was a while ago, it was low single digits. Even though that's really useful, people won't do it. But they will do tagging, in part because there's a immediate personal gain that you get out of it because you're organizing your stuff, but also for many people, they feel like they're contributing to a stream of knowledge. And it's easy enough to do, and so they do it. It's a really interesting mix of the altruistic and the selfish. I don't know.
Yeah, I wanted to, so far we've been talking about organising knowledge, but do you think the knowledge itself is actually changing? In other words, do you think we actually are seeing the world in a different way because of the ability to organise the knowledge that way?
Yeah, so there's a couple, knowledge is changing in that I think that by miscellaneizing the field, by getting past the notion that there are set ways, we make more of it available. Secondly, we are developing not only new forms of authority that are opening the floodgates, we're also developing increased sensitivity to the metadata that expresses how trustworthy knowledge should be. Right. So, just to be specific, Public Library of Science or MedCentral, PLOS or MedCentral. These are right now. Oh God, it's so frustrating. You're a scientist. You publish. You have research. You have to submit it. It gets peer reviewed. Peer review is very important. That's not the big stranglehold. The big stranglehold is the journals are only this thick because they're made out of paper. It's not because that's all that we need to know. It's that this is all that we can afford to print. And then companies charge $20,000 for a subscription to them, even though frequently the research was done using government money. But don't get me started. So, with of what? From what I can tell, they are having their arms twisted successfully. So that CERN, the particle accelerator at CERN, which is the most exciting physics around, they're insisting that research only be published in open access journals. They've got some clout, and Elsevier is responding because they don't want to get frozen out of the most important physics research. And Elsevier has a program that provides lower cost access or free access in developing countries. So there's been progress. Nevertheless, simply the fact that you have to limit what gets printed to what we know to what gets printed is a terrible, stupid limitation. So PLOS has the program called PLOS One, where they peer review lots and lots of stuff, because peer review is still an important way to establish trust. But then they publish anything that passes the peer review, whether it's significant science or not. Nature, which has been quite progressive in many ways, by the way, nevertheless, it publishes the most important science. Well, that's fine, but there's lots of science that isn't page one that we really want scientists to have access to. And Archive, the ARXIV, the pre-pub place, says, no, just even before it's been sent to a journal, send it to us. We'll make it available. You have to have some scientific standing, be it a university, but otherwise, no peer review, and they don't pretend otherwise. So you go to Archive and you find stuff that maybe you can't trust, but you know that because it's an archive. But maybe there's raw data there that works with yours and that changes the way we think about the world. So the content of knowledge is rapidly evolving because of our making this stuff more miscellaneous. The nature of it changes as well, because if you change the authority, that is why we trust it, you're changing something deep and important about the knowledge itself. The content may be the same, but our understanding of it is based around the metadata with which we accept it, the condition, the context in which we accept it. And simply that it was published in a major journal, that it came through a credentialed source, is no longer either necessary or sufficient. There's one more little thing that changed about knowledge, which is we have carried around a metaphysics that says that knowledge is something we have in our heads. As soon as you think about where the knowledge is on a mailing list, that metaphysics no longer holds. The knowledge itself is not in anybody's head. It's in the discussion.
Can you talk about the importance of the volume of information? So, for instance, in the Wikipedia, you talked about how at the beginning it was, kind of a geek fest, if you will, and so if I wanted to learn about Africa, it wouldn't be a very good source. But there was a point where it had enough volume to kind of become worthy. So, for instance, let's say you start a site out there that's about toe pain or something like that, and people are going to submit ideas and information. If you have 5 people submitting information, you probably don't have very good information. But if you have 100,000 people submitting information, you probably have good information.
So the initial argument against tagging, one of them was, well, it's fine when a few people are doing it, but what happens when hundreds of millions? It's going to be chaos. And it turns out that the large numbers actually tend away from chaos. So that at Flickr, the photo sharing site, they have, a year ago, they had over 500 million tags. That's a lot of tags. And if you go to Flickr and you search on something like Capri, it will ask you, do you mean these Capri, which is the island, photos of the island, or this Capri, which is photos of the car Capri? And it does that without any analysis of the color of the pixels, or it's just looking at the tag sets. And the accuracy of the clustering that it does based upon the tags is astounding. This is astounding. Flickr's favorite example is you can search for photos of dog noses or cat noses with great precision. It will do the clustering based solely upon the tag. So the large number of tags gives us a statistical base which allows us to actually get more accurate and interesting. Now, it does mean that if you're looking for photos of San Francisco, you are not going to find all the photos that in fact are of San Francisco, and you may find some that are not. You may find some SF photos that are tagged that way that are in fact Santa Fe or Sally Fields or something else. And you may miss the picture from somebody's, takes a picture of her cat in the window with the Golden Gate in the background, and she tags it Tabby, because that's the name of her cat, and the system doesn't know. But who cares? You're just trying to find some photos of San Francisco, and there's 750,000 of them anyway, or whatever the number is. If you're doing research on, because you're a lawyer, and you want to find all of the case law relevant to something, not finding stuff is not acceptable. So it's a little domain specific, but for a lot of our life and for our works, it's sufficient.
I'm thinking about the opposite problem where you don't have enough people, right? So I assume that more people is good with tagging.
Okay.
I use Flickr and doing all that kind of stuff, and so I feel like the more people you have, the better, because it'll even out over time. But if you don't have enough people, then your tagging is weak.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm just wondering, is there any way to think about what's enough for any subject?
Somebody will, because there's a bunch of statistical questions. How many are enough? If everybody in a folksonomy, in a domain of taggers, nobody repeats tags, all the tags are unique, you're dead. There's nothing that emerges from that. If everybody tags everything with only one tag, you're dead, because there's nothing interesting emerging from that. So there's some shape of a curve that says this is the maximum one for most information, most significance, most interestingness, and we need statisticians to be working on this. I am so humanities major that I don't know. But there are dissertations already being written, I assume, about this very question. Sorry, I should have done you. Yeah.
Thoughts on the open source versus closed source model on software, and figuring that out in the light of patents and ownership of information and all that kind of stuff.
Why do you have to ask that at Microsoft today?
I'm sorry. But it's complicated. I know.
So, I have a set of opinions about open source that are not worth expressing and are totally predictable, just as my politics are. I'm a Boston Jew. You can figure out everything I believe just from that. Right. My tag cloud is totally predictable. So the question is, in taking this in terms of the miscellaneous, which I guess is what I'm here to talk about. One of the advantages of open source is that it generates this enormous amount of code, which then, if properly tagged and metadataed and all the rest of it, can be reassembled in interesting ways. And that is more likely to lead on a global scale to innovation than gathering the best coders on a campus in a really lovely part of the world. You'll get really good stuff if you do that, but the miscellaneousness of the interaction among people who have not been chosen but are randomly colliding is likely to be unparalleled. Now, you lose a lot of efficiency in trying to code in an open source in a miscellaneous world. You don't know the quality of what's being done, for example. There's a lot of inefficiency. So it's not the case that, you say, let's build a dam, everybody get together on Saturday and bring your waders and a shovel and we'll do it. That's not going to work. There are projects where you just can't do it that way. So, as always, it's domain specific.
You lose a level of efficiency also.
In particular, I work in security, and open source is very bad for security.
Well, there are certainly those who, for example, I should not be arguing this with you at all. In the realm of voting machines, e-voting machines, there is certainly an argument that the proprietary solutions which guarantee security cannot be known to provide enough security, and thus open source security is actually the only way in that sort of situation to proceed.
Well, I couldn't disagree with you more. But
well,
do that afterwards.
not only couldn't you disagree with me more, but I can't say anything more, so I'm at the end of my knowledge. So certainly leave the last word with you. So. Oh, yes, sir. Sorry. Is there anybody else so I can avoid you further?
So you very clearly believe that this miscellaneous thing is the way the world is naturally carved up, to go back to Plato. But a lot of, in fact, all of the evidence used to support this claim seem to be already within this realm. I mean, if we can get 5,000 pictures of cat noses, okay, that might be an advantage to some people, but is it really better? Now, you clearly think it's better, but even the word better is an Aristotelian concept of the hierarchy of perfection. Okay. It feels like. I'm wondering, is it better? What kind of evidence would you marshal to show that it is better to work this way rather than the old-fashioned?
So the reason that it is better in a non-Aristotelian way, in a very practical, functional way, which is not to say but in the sense in which you're using Aristotelian, that is that an order baked into the universe better, which is not my intention, is that we get all of the old ways of ordering plus the new. If it makes sense to have the Dewey Decimal System, that's what works in this environment, or any top-down taxonomy that's carefully ordered and tightly controlled and operates on the basis of unambiguous definitions for the placement and criteria for the placement of objects in the same. If that's what works, then absolutely you can do that. The point is we don't have to make these decisions anymore. So if the opinion of the editors of the New York Times matters to you, and it matters, by the way, to me, so you want to see what those editors think are the most important stories on the planet, good, absolutely, we have them. But now we don't only have them. So it is, I'm actually going to stay away from empirical evidence, in part because I'm a humanities major, but simply on the theoretical ground that if it's good to have, so if one believes, as I do, that organizational schemes are not readouts, simple readouts of how the world is, with one best one being there, or one real one being established, but instead view them as tools that enable us to do things. So in some cases they help us arrange a kitchen for maximum efficiency so we don't have to walk across every time we want to get another spice. They're right over here. We move them over here. That's great. That was our aim. In another case, we're trying to divide things up, divide candy up for our children after Halloween so none of them are crying. And so we do that. And then we can do it that way. If an organization is a tool, then having more of them that are better suited to your particular interest is ipso facto better in a very practical and functional way.
Maybe a couple more questions.
Two here. Sorry. One, I'll help you sell your book. Was that your talk, the first chapter, or the summary of the book? Where else do you go with this? That's kind of what I'm asking there.
The first chapter is actually, the prologue is actually a trick chapter. And I got interviewed on the radio, part of the book tour. I got interviewed on the radio by somebody who claimed to have read the book, but very clearly only read the first chapter. And I know this because his characterization of the book was, first chapter is about I go to a Staples store, a simulator store, a full-size store where they try arranging merchandise, and so he told his audience the book is about arranging merchandise. No, it's my fault. What can I say? This touches on the broad themes in the book.
The second was, a Martian looking at Wikipedia would assume that the Peloponnesian War was still important because it was there. So in some sense, what you really want is other kinds of metadata to be serviced. How many people click that page?
Yeah, the Martian would want that.
Yeah,
although, this touches exactly on one of the dangers of folksonomies, which is that, let's say we had that, the Martian gets access to the server logs at Wikipedia. That Martian very likely would see that the Paris Hilton article was clicked 100 million gazillion times more often than the Peloponnesian War one. And if the Martian had full access, would see the Peloponnesian one was never clicked on anybody who was out of high school. So if we then take this information and say, well, okay, now we know what humans are interested in, and let's skew things that way, we end up with a dumbocracy. I mean, a dumbocracy, right? So here's an example from Google, which I think you may enjoy. I don't know if you followed this in the past couple days, but somebody posted, and it's true, that if you search for, quote, he invented, Google asks, did you mean she invented? Oh, you're exactly right. This is how to tell a good story. Yeah. So take the punchline and just make it the first thing I said. Yeah. So exactly. So this is clearly not Google.
Just because you asked the question, Susan.
This is clearly not Google's in the back room, somebody saying, oh, let's be as sexist as we can. This is a result of what is in effect a folksonomy operating at Google. Where, same thing happened, by the way, at Amazon a while ago, where if you search for abortion for a while, it would say, did you mean adoption? Which got some people very upset. And it's simply because of whatever analysis they did of pairs of things that people look for and how near misspellings that came up with this. Well, so this is if it's in fact, in the case of did you mean he invented, it's because there are so many more he invented references. And so here, sort of a folksonomy has led to not an optimal result. The real key thing I think about folksonomies is that they will suffer from exactly the same problems as taxonomies, namely it's one view unless we say that a folksonomy is not simply the people's taxonomy, bottom up replacing top down, but the point about a folksonomy is that we know all of the plurality, all the minority tagging that's going on. We can use that as well to allow people to search in ways that are meaningful to them, even if they're not meaningful to the majority.
I have one comment there. So when you're talking about physical versus digital, I thought the difference may not be as big. But for instance, in terms of the arrangement of the merchants in Walmart, if everything gets tagged with RFID, I don't care how it's arranged. It can be just arranged, any kind of arrangement. Well, you can access them easily. Huh?
When you're in the Walmart, the physical Walmart, there'll be some type of digital display.
No, I'm talking about if every single item has been tagged.
Yeah, with an RFID
like
tag.
Digital files.
But they still have to put them on a shelf somewhere.
But the same thing, right? I mean, your digital songs and books have to put in computer memory, right? It's just one big, one small. But physical item is still there, except one is tagged, so it's easier to access.
I mean, so RFIDs are really interesting because they merge the physical and the digital, and they allow so much more metadata, which they do primarily one assumes they'll be using serial numbers.
So my point is that the key difference is that whether you allow to have the metadata associated with whatever object you have, rather than whether it's physical or digital. Is it? That's the way I understand, the key.
Well, so I think I'm not understanding. Right now, UPC, Universal Product Codes, I keep calling them price codes, and that's just wrong. The barcode is a simple serial number which has value because it points to a database where there's untold amounts of information, everything from manufacturer to price and inventory levels. So we already have a physical way of presenting access to a digital system with huge amounts of metadata, but we still have to take the camera and put it on the shelf, and if I want to find it, I still have to walk down the aisle.
The point is that the metadata is not rich enough. If it's rich enough, it gives you a whole bunch of attributes as digital.
But it is rich enough. The key, I think, to the RFID is that it will present a unique ID, and the unique ID is a pointer to wherever but UPCs do exactly the same thing at the cash register. They don't bother tracking a lot of information, but it could point. It's a pointer. It goes to a database. It could point to Wikipedia. We already have a system that combines to some extent the physical and even so, when we walk down the aisle, they're still going to put the bananas in the back to make us pass, because that's what most people want. One of the most, in order to see the stuff we don't want to see. They still use the physical against us. Online, they can't, because we'll leave. Those are pop-ups. It's the equivalent of space in the store. Pop-ups. We'll leave.
Maybe one more question, and then we're going to make interim after designing.
Okay.
Go ahead.
You talked about sharing of information in science journals and experiments. What about in medicine? Do you see this being done in medicine at all?
Well, absolutely. I mean, Biomed Central is the equivalent of Public Library of Science. It's a commercial venture, and it's particularly interested in in biology and the medical sciences. There are tons and tons of, so in terms of basic research, I think the situation is really the same, whether it's physics or medicine. In terms of this whole other area of patient tracking and record keeping, where it intersects with privacy concerns, so in general, I mean, I'm not a computer scientist, but it seems that often the key here is to have a unique ID that is itself meaningless, but can be associated with all sorts of meaning up and down. It's a very efficient way of doing this. In the politics of personal medicine, there's a great deal of resistance to having a single identifier for each person because of the possibilities of abuse, of violations of privacy, and it stands in the way of stuff that everybody wants to have happen. Nobody wants to go to a doctor, be brought in, God forbid, on a stretcher unconscious, the naked unconscious person in the stretcher scenario. Well, sorry, all you have is your wallet with your ID in it. So I had to change it. Where did you put your wallet if you're naked? Anyway, well, you don't want to be taken to the clinic and they can't automatically find out that you were being treated last year over here for something that's relevant. We all want that sort of information to flow, but we also really don't want it all to flow because there's personal stuff. It's a terrible, terrible problem. But that's at the intersection of information and privacy and politics, and that's what makes makes that particular problem so thorny. This is really a nightmare.
Now, the other issue about
I'll answer quickly.
Are these peer-reviewed journals?
Those two are both peer-reviewed journals.
Are there any non-peer-reviewed where you're sharing information that hasn't been, vetted by?
Yes, it's called the web. Yeah, there's lots of places where people can post information that hasn't been peer-reviewed. As I mentioned at Archive, the ARXIV, it's explicitly, you wrote it, you post it, and if you read it, you understand that this has not been looked at. So you get great science, you get crackpot science, and you get great science at its very early stages. The opening up of publication from simply publishing things that we are guaranteed, that's great, but it's very limiting. So as long as you have the metadata associated with stuff that has not been peer-reviewed, may not be good science, it opens up the doors to knowledge it's just a really great example of the value of making things miscellaneous. Thank you very much.